Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's interview, I interviewed Dr. Peg Hurley Dawson. Dr. Dawson is certified in sex therapy, IFS, EMDR, clinical hypnosis, trained in sensorimotor psychotherapy, relational life therapy, Sandtray, Sandplay, Polyvagal Theory, and is a sex therapy supervisor and registered Sandplay practitioner. She specializes in treating individuals, couples, LGBTQ, out-of-control sexual behavior, complex trauma, PTSD, sex and relationship issues, and gender identity. Working with adults, she utilizes Deepening IFS, internal family systems, using Sandtray with Miniatures to help them heal through visual representation of their parts. This is really an interesting conversation, and I love what Dr. Dawson is doing with drawing from all the theories mentioned above to really support people in a unique healing process, and I think you'll learn a lot in this episode. So without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Dawson. All right, Dr. Dawson, thanks for taking the time to be on the Mind of a Therapist podcast. The first question I like to ask guests is, how do you view change? What does it take for someone to change, for an internal system, an external system to change? What's your take on change?
So I love that question because I really believe that people do change, and internally and externally, because when the internal change happens, the external change shows up kind of automatically, because as the person changes, things around them, how they relate to things, are going to be in a different way because they change, and how then that in return changes how they respond to people, and how people will naturally respond back from a different way, hopefully from a different way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the person probably needs to change too.
Yeah. Will you say more about how you generally see in your clinical practice that internal change take place?
So in my practice, I work with a lot of miniatures, sand, I work with the unconscious, and I do Sandtray and Sandplay, which we can get in later if you have any questions about that. Happy to get involved with that. So when I say I work with the unconscious, what I do is a method of Sandplay. And in Sandplay, I actually have to, I'm getting a call, I have to decline that. Sorry.
No problem.
So in Sandplay, what happens in Sandplay is we work with it's based in play theory, Jungian therapy, and also Eastern influence. And with that, it's based really from this woman in Sweden was working to be a Jungian analyst, and she worked with Carl Jung and Emma Jung. And she also was very influenced by Eastern influence, because when Tibet was invaded, she would take in a lot of the Tibetan monks right in her home. And she also was fascinated with how play changed a lot of kids, and she was interested in this woman, Margaret Lowenfeld, which was in England in around the she studied with her around late 1940-ish, 45. And what she developed was Margaret Lowenfeld actually worked with sand and miniatures with children, and Dorkhoff studied under her for about a year. And when they separated, Margaret Lowenfeld said, I want to call this a world play. And Dorkhoff said, I really love this, and I'd like to call it Sandplay. And so they decided they would use the different terms, and Sandplay was established, and it's really based in Jungian influence against play therapy and Eastern influence. And so that began, and there's a whole study of Sandplay that is a very rigorous training, and we don't talk a lot in it. We witness the client, and the client just uses miniatures, and they collect miniatures, and they don't really know why they're collecting them, but their unconscious kind of selects miniatures as they go through and choose them, and then they put them in a tray, and the tray is designed a certain width, depth, and dimension also. So I hope that makes some sense.
You mentioned a bit there about what Sandtray is. If you were to explain both Sandtray and Sandplay to someone who had never heard of that approach to psychotherapy, could you describe both of them in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, so I'll try to make this very brief, that Sandtray is used through the lens of a modality that the therapist kind of works in, whether it's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, internal family systems, or cognitive behavioral, and any modality that somebody studies, they can apply in the sand. They can have miniatures in a tray, and they can work with parts of the person, or with a person externalizing their emotions, and work through the modality and do Sandtray. And Sandplay is really more about working with the unconscious and letting what happens arise naturally over a series of trays. Sandplay is not based on any one modality. It's really based in a very kind of regimented kind of way of seeing and working with clients, where you really attune to them, you witness, you presence with them, and when they talk, we can talk to them, but we really let them kind of work their issues out in the tray. And when a lot of my clients that do both really enjoy Sandplay, because it changes them from the inside out in a way without really, and it works with all kinds of traumas, but it doesn't really bring the trauma up into your face. It's as if the subconscious is showing pieces of it, because in your right brain is really working somatically and doesn't have language, and we really accessing the right brain, and the where we don't have language, where it works in metaphors and images, and all the miniatures represent various images. Various things, whether good or bad, and multi-layered. And so the unconscious really pulls things, and the person, many times I'll say, tell me about this world you created. And they'll say, I have no idea, Peg. And That's when I say, you're doing it right. Because the left brain doesn't know why it's choosing, wolf or a tent or whatever it's choosing, but it works really profoundly.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering is you'll invite the client to place the different figurines, which are they're little miniatures, right? Plastic.
Well, I have some bronze, I have plastic, I have wooden, and you have your miniature collection as a therapist. Sandplay or Sandtray represents everything you can imagine: metaphorical, animals, symbolism, parts, anything can be. Really want to have a broad representation of everything, and as much as you can, and quite diverse.
Absolutely. And I had the privilege, you showed me your Sandplay room, and unfortunately we're not doing a visual podcast, or else I'd invite you to show our listeners, but she has just walls and walls covered with these figurines and these miniatures. And so you invite the client to pick out miniatures and place them in certain. What sort of prompts are you giving as a practitioner?
It depends. If I'm doing Sandtray, I'm giving a prompt. Like, let's work with your anger. Let's work with the part of you that does whatever, is frustrated. Let's work with whatever the issue is of the day. Mm-hmm. And we find miniatures, and sometimes we let them make a tray of X problem. And that's when I'm a little more directive. And we talk with the client, and so many people do Sandtray, and that's one way to do it. Sandplay is an entirely different animal, play or sand experience, where we actually ask the client to just kind of pick miniatures that come to them, or they feel, or they sense, and just pick them, and then we invite them to use the tray and just put them wherever they feel that they want to be. The miniatures want to be, and sometimes people will not know why they put them in, and then they move them. And they're like, well, that's really something. I moved it in a place that I don't know why I moved it, but the unconscious is literally laying it out, that whatever they're trying, the unconscious trying to show this, the conscious mind, but it's not using language. So the left brain will come on board and say something about it. And it's everything the client says and much, much more, including what the client says. But should I tell, I could tell the story of the tents.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So Sandplay was a beautiful example of how that works in sex therapy. Is I had a client that came for me for out of control sexual behavior, which we only did Sandplay, and whereas he's just collecting miniatures and putting them in and not knowing what he's doing and just kind of going with the flow, trusting a process. And he ended up choosing one particular time. He healed from his out of control sexual behavior, but he was having difficulty having erections with his wife. He was losing his erection. So his wife thought, you're not finding me attractive. And he's like, I actually do, but I'm finding I'm just having performance anxiety for some reason. So he came in after he kind of healed from his OCSB, which we call out of control sexual behavior or problematic sexual behavior. And so came in and said, Peg, I'm really having trouble. I'm losing my erection. My wife thinks it's her. It's not. I don't know why. I'm just having performance anxiety. So I said, do a tray. So he did it. I said, let's do a Sandplay, see what comes up. So he literally did a Sandplay, and he said, Peg, I picked a tent, TENT, from one area and another tent from another area. I don't know why I chose two tents. I said, well, let's kind of put them in and let's talk about the tray, which he did. And then I document every tray, and he left, and it was so funny because he was so worried. And when he left, I realized when I was documenting the tray that he did put two tents in. And I was wondering, I called him up because it dawned on me that maybe what was happening, I don't know for sure, but it was really wild when he heard me say this. I said, I called him, and he's leaving in the car. And I said, are you feeling really anxious with your wife? He says, yeah, I'm so anxious. I said, are you feeling tense? And he says, I'm really, really tense. I said, are you feeling too tense? And he says, yeah, I'm feeling really tense. I said, it's interesting you chose two tents, and you kind of place them in the tray close together, and that's haphazard. It just not haphazard. The psyche knows what it's doing. And I said, I think that maybe possible is your unconscious is trying to tell you you're too tense, but it can't say too tense. It doesn't have language, so it uses metaphor and uses two tense because it's trying to say two tense. That's one example of just something that was really amusing to me and really made sense to him once we brought it to his attention. Normally, we wouldn't bring something to the client's attention like that because we want it to process naturally and in a series of trays. But he had done his work, what he had come in for, and he was still doing more work that he wanted to do because he was getting tense. And he's no longer seeing me, which is lovely, right? He's healed.
Wow.
And it's profound. It's just so much fun.
So do you find that a part of the healing process then is allowing that unconscious mind to express itself?
I think the healing process in Sandplay is exactly that, allowing the process to happen at the pace the subconscious puts in. And what's happening is it's dealing with past traumas, present issues. It's kind of working with a lot of the psyche all at one time. And I like to think of it in this way, if I may use an analogy, that Sandtray is like if the body had cancer in all parts of the body, Sandtray is like focusing on the liver and healing that, and parts of the liver around it will heal. And Sandplay is like immersing the whole body in a liquid solution, and then all parts of the cancer are kind of taken care of. So the analogy says cancer, but it's really about parts of us maybe that need more attention, that just need attention, and how we focus on how we make that attention. Sandplay is kind of all inclusive, where Sandtray appears in this in what I'm saying here and how I view it as one aspect of the situation.
Yeah, that makes
Does
sense.
that make sense?
Yeah. And
Like,
I wanted to kind of shift gears. I'm super interested in Sandplay and Sandtray and appreciate all that information. I was also curious to hear a bit about the polyvagal theory. I've talked
oh,
a bit about that on the podcast, but not much. And it's new to me. I know the basic tenets, but I'd be curious if you could share with our listeners a bit about the basic premises of the polyvagal theory and how that informs psychotherapy.
Okay. So polyvagal theory, I find, is critical to how I view non-pathologizing what's happening with my clients. So polyvagal, I was introduced into polyvagal theory, and I studied with Deb Dana, who studied in my world, the matriarch of of polyvagal theory. She's done a lot of work, and she studied with Stephen Porges, who had this designed the polyvagal theory, and they worked quite well together. And Stephen Porges is incredible. He's wonderful. But Deb Dana has a way of taking his theory and pulling it down to a level where clinicians can make sense of it. And so I actually studied with Deb when she was in Maine. She's now moved to Chicago, I believe. And when she was in Maine, she did a beautiful job of intensive training, and she would teach how to see the polyvagal theory, how to feel it, how it works for you in your body, and also how it works for your clients. And to really understand it, she would map the system. And she has a fabulous book called The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy. And it's wonderful. And I suggest any clinician or any person listening to your podcast that's interested, read that book. It's wonderful. And it even has example of things that you can do as in practice. And the different states are basically metaphorically, you're on a ladder that goes up and down constantly. And at the top of this ladder, if you want to consider it the top, but is this calm, curious, centered, ventral vagal, they call it, or IFS calls it self, and they have similar qualities: calm, curious, connected, compassionate, all of that. And then when you mobilize, you're going to mobilize up and down this ladder. And it's a ladder because you can't just jump to the bottom, which is one way. You kind of go through sympathetic arousal or the mobilization. And when you mobilize, there's two ways to mobilize. One is more of a safe, where it feels safe. You're kind of receiving cues of safety. And this is called neuroception. You receive these cues of danger or safety that the body is constantly searching whether I'm safe or I'm not. And if the environment feels safe, you will actually go to yoga, walk your dog, you're kind of doing art, everything is wonderful, and you're kind of mobilizing in that way. If your body's sensing, and Stephen Porges coined the word neuroception because there was no word to say what this is, with the body receiving information. And if you're neurocepting, which is the five senses, informing the autonomic nervous system or the body, whether it's safe or not. And if you get information that is not safe, you will actually mobilize in a different type of way, which is more sympathetically aroused or more energy. And as a sex therapist, some of the energy I see that comes to my office is out of control sexual behavior, problematic sexual behavior, and other issues. And I had a client that came in that was a woman who had vaginismus, which is pain with penetration. And there was we did a lot of work with that, and she healed, which was wonderful, doing the Sandplay stuff. And then when then you immobilize, you can't stay in sympathetic arousal too long. You end up having cortisol comes into the system. And then when you're immobilizing on a safe way, you're going to have rest and restore, which is immobilization, rest and restore. Or you're going to immobilize in a different way, which is more dorsal or checked out state. So I find with my clients who have problematic sexual behavior, they end up working their body in a way that it's not, I don't look at it as a sex addiction. I look at it as a regulation problem. So what's happening, they're sympathetically aroused, they end up, and the body will seek pleasure over pain any day. So one of the pleasurable things is to have an orgasm. So it's in that state where they're using, searching for an orgasm, or looking at whatever it is, going to massage parlors, sexual imagery, sex workers, or whatever it is that they actually don't want to do, but they find themselves doing this, masturbating too much, or whatever they consider too much. And then they end up having that ejaculation or orgasm. And then they end up in this shame or guilt, which is the cycle going to dorsal vagal. And then they need to mobilize again. So they end up having to get out of this helpless state, or really feeling powerless. And they're thinking about how shame, and this is where shame and guilt lives. And then they go back into sympathetic arousal, and they end up doing this behavior because it works, not because they're addicted. You can't really be addicted to your own hormones. But a lot of people call it sex addiction. I do not. I rather think of it as a regulation situation.
Yeah.
So when you think of through the polyvagal lens, that makes sense.
Sure. Someone's dysregulated. They're in that sympathetic state. They're feeling anxiety, distress, and this is a way to feel better. Huh?
I'm nodding my head.
Yeah.
I'm total agreement. Yes,
yeah.
That's exactly what I believe.
And so is part of polyvagal, then you talked about, well, first of all, I love that ladder metaphor. I hadn't heard that before.
Oh, that's Deb Dana.
What? Yeah.
Direct learning from Deb Dana.
It's a great way to conceptualize. It's not just 1 to 100, right? We'd fall somewhere on that ladder from that calm ventral state to that aroused, sympathetic, very distressed state. And so as a clinician, part of the role would be staying in that ventral state then. And I think I've heard that associated with polyvagal is staying regulated helps those around us stay regulated.
Well, that's true. They call it co-regulation. Mm-hmm. And when the bodies do kind of meet each other, where if somebody stays regulated, it's most likely it's going to assist the other person coming into regulation. It's co-regulation. And that happens, well, the neuroception happens if you can be calm or the therapist can be calm, most likely the client's system is going to sense calmness, and maybe they can regulate and come into the space. I had a new client yesterday who had a lot of trauma as a child, brand new client. And there's a 9-minute video that I showed her on the Polyvagal Institute website that talks about the introduction to ANS, or autonomic nervous system. And we watched that together, and she was quite impressed. And she was able to come into the room, and knowing polyvagal theory, I knew that the space is designed to have clients right from the waiting room to really adjust to a sense of safety. And I tried desperately to have people come in, sit, and it's a more relaxing space. And even where we meet, I have them come in. I say, I think your autonomic nervous system. I start right off the bat talking about how they need to spend a little bit of time just to sense the space, see the space. And all this is the neuroception and allowing them to adjust to the space. And
wow.
So we take a few minutes to do that.
That's great. And I see a plant right next to you. I see greens. It seems like a smoothing place. And what a great way to start a session for someone. It takes some time to adjust to this place. I mean, I think of driving just in general for me is pretty stressful, and you're generally we're running from thing to thing, and that's such a great prompt. I'd be curious. You mentioned and you told me outside of this recording that clinical example of that woman who had vaginismus. Will you share a bit about that story? Because it was pretty profound in terms of speaking to the power of the Sandplay.
Yeah, the power of the sand and the unconscious, right? So this is one case, 1-to-1 is the it's a one-to-one case. It's not like I've had a lot of people that can't have come. Most people come to me for OCSB or problematic sexual behavior, but I have women that do come to me. And she had been to every therapist, and she's mid 50s, and came to me and said, I've been to every therapist and you do this thing that's different. I'll give you 5 sessions. I said, okay, let's kind of work with that. And I end up hearing from her. She studied psychology, and she really knew a lot of things, but she was having problems where she couldn't be penetrated by a penis or any. She didn't have problems. Some women have vaginismus so badly that they can't even put a tampon in, and it's just so painful. So they don't. And so she was having this problem for a long time, and she ended up leaving her first relationship where she was with a man, and she ended up going into a lesbian relationship for 8 years. And in that relationship, she said, I was identified as the problem one. I'm sick and tired of being the problem person, the person with all the problems. And then she ended up meeting another person who was a man, and she was like, fell in love with him. And she said to him, I don't think, my gynecologist told me I will never have penetrative sex again. So I don't think we're going to be able to have penetrative sex. Is that going to be a problem? He said, no, I love you for you, and we'll work around that, which is beautiful for him.
That is beautiful.
Yeah. And then she came to me and said, I'm tired. I want to be able to have sex with my partner and penetrative sex. And I said, yeah, I get that. So we worked in the tray, and we did some work where it took 11 sessions to heal her, where she was able to have penetrative sex with her partner, and now she doesn't even need to use lube, and she's able to have multiple orgasms. They have a lot of sex. But what happened, she met the part of her, I do IFS, internal family systems, Sandtray lens. Well, my Sandtray is through an IFS lens. So we met the part of her that was actually in charge of keeping her vagina tight. And it was a little miniature, about 5 inches tall, that were leather chaps, leather bra, studded bra, leather panties, heels, boots, and a gun. And it had a lot of presence. And so she chooses this. And then there's a way you can talk directly to the miniature and have her talk to the miniature. And the miniature informed her that she was protecting her. And sure enough, she was. And she ended up was abused by her own father and uncle as a very young child. And so this miniature talked to her and said, you never listened to me. I tell you, I'm going to protect you, and you never listen to me. And so she ended up meeting that part. She talked to it. And then 2 weeks later, she came in. And in the meantime, we had done Sandplay and Sandtray. But in this particular session, we did Sandtray. And 2 weeks later, she came in and she said, you're not going to believe this. I said, what? She said, I had sex 5 times within the last 2 weeks. And 4 of them, I was able to, I talked to her, and we were able to have penetrative sex, and it was wonderful. And then she said, I said, what happened on the 5th time or the 5th time? She said, well, had a little drinking, didn't talk to her. And she said, no way. And it was by not addressing the part of her that was trying to protect her, that the part said, no way.
Yeah.
And she wasn't able to be penetrated. It's just amazing. And now, yeah, it's amazing.
It is an amazing story, and speaks to that connection between the mind and body. You know, these parts of us, we have to take them seriously, and we have to show up in relationship with them, because if we don't, then they'll start to run the show, right? But it is just, it's amazing to me that physical symptoms like that can clear up when we get to know ourselves on this really deep level.
It is a deeper level, and it's not, you cannot separate the mind and the brain, the head and the body.
Yeah.
And so many people address this as a head issue. Oh, it's psychosomatic or whatever it is. They're not addressing both. It's both and there's aspects of us that are in charge. And it's not, sometimes not what we want to be in charge, but it's not us in charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
The parts of us that are kind of running the show and really want to protect us, and all parts have a positive intent.
Yeah.
As they say in internal family systems. It's a beautiful modality.
Yeah. And you talked, I can tell you have so much passion about IFS, about Sandtray, Sandplay, Polyvagal. You're so knowledgeable too. I'm very impressed. I have to say that with
Thank you.
your integration of, you haven't mentioned EMDR yet, but you're trained in
I did
EMDR and
EMDR,
incorporate
and
these
I,
models.
yeah,
But I
and
be
yeah.
curious,
So,
before we recorded the other day when we were talking, you talked a bit about your own personal experience with, it was with IFS and Sand, is that right?
no, I had,
Or,
I think any therapist, they call us the wounded healers. And I think there's a purpose reason for that. And so, and I tell all my clients, I've been where you are. And I have been on the side of the sofa that I wasn't the therapist. And, through that, I was so determined to heal or try to get better. And, I had a whole situation that I won't go into here. But what ended up happening is I had a clinician with EMDR training. And so I went through EMDR training as a client, and I also went through it as a therapist, and I got certified in EMDR. That was the first modality that I was certified in. And when I was training in EMDR, I learned about this method. Somebody said, "Is this going to be like that part stuff?" And I said, "What part stuff?" And they said, "Well, internal family system." So I was like, that's next on my list. So I end up doing all the trainings, when the trainings now are by lottery only to get in. And now I did it years and years and years ago, where I was able to get into a trainings, and I did my trainings. And then I got an IFS therapist, IFS supervisor, until I got certified in that. And then I know what it's like to be on that side of the sofa on IFS. And then I was really curious about the body. So I took Sensorimotor Psychotherapy training, Sensorimotor. So I did that, the trauma training in that. And I integrated that. I'm integrating EMDR with IFS. And then I'm integrating Sensorimotor with EMDR and IFS. And all of these, trying it with all of the others. And then I thought, well, I was doing clinical hypnosis. And then I learned, so I got certified in that. And then I realized I did my level 3 hypnosis training, and they brought somebody in from Ericksonian hypnosis out in Arizona. And I said, I don't know what this guy's doing, but I love it. And I want to study that. So I went out and studied Ericksonian hypnosis, got certified in that. And then I probably did. And then, of course, I wanted to be a sex therapist. So, of course, now I'm a sex therapist supervisor. And I loved studying out of control sexual behavior. I went out and studied that and worked with the LGBTQI plus community. And so I've just been, it's been crazy. But I've spent a lot of years studying and being both sides of the sofa. But it wasn't until I met a Sandplay person. I was in Bessel van der Kolk's trauma training years ago, and they did showed different aspects of different type of work. And then somebody showed Sandplay, and that unfortunately that person has passed on. But they showed Sandplay, and I ended up finding a Sandplay therapist. And it wasn't until that changed my life 180%. Or maybe, I don't even know if that's 180, it changed it all around. And then I healed from a way I never realized I could heal. And Sandplay, in my mind, is so profound because I've been through it. I was supposed to do 30 sessions and study all these requirements to be a Sandplay person, a registered Sandplay practitioner, which I am now, heading towards writing something on. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I just got a call. I had to.
Oh, no problem.
So there you are back. So nice. So I end up studying under the practitioner. I did 30 trays, which was the requirement, but of course I had to do 70 plus trays. And then what happened to me is this alignment of I just can imagine, it's like the soul and the ego align, and they're on the same page, and it spontaneously healed all this part of me that felt not good enough for many, many years. And I just had this alignment, and it's like, so my confidence, everything changed. And it was so profound. I attribute my major healings for the last was Sandplay.
Wow.
right, for my own personal process.
Yeah, feel free if you don't want to share more not to, but I'm curious to hear a bit more about the specifics of what that looked like. You talked about this connection of soul and ego, and just this confidence and healing from this part that felt like it wasn't enough.
I think we all have parts. I end up designing these cards I call pro-symptom beliefs. And what they are really is parts of us that I know in the scientific world, they're calling them this. I didn't know this until I wrote for my Ph.D. This idea of default mode networks, which is a scientific term for what happens when we focus on beliefs. And if you're focusing on negative beliefs, you end up feeling there's a lot of negative things about you. And you have these concepts that are not true, but feel true. And what happened to me when I did Sandplay was, there was this like healing of, I no longer feel not good enough. I no longer feel I don't know what to do. I no longer feel, and it happened over a period of time. It took me to do 70 plus trays. It took me 3 years, but that was the best 3 years of my life. And it was like any kind of trauma I had was healed. Wow. It just healed. And it wasn't traumatic to heal it. It was like, it just week after week, I would go and do my trays and there was it's a whole attunement by the therapist, the witnessing, allowing your subconscious just to kind of do, and then you become, when you're making a tray, there's no words to put it, so it's wordless, but when you become one with the sand, and it feels weird to hear myself saying it, but it's just such a intimate experience with yourself.
Yeah.
And you shift and change, and it happens in a way that you don't expect it, but it happens.
Yeah.
Clients, it's so funny when I work with my OCSB or with clients that come to me and identify as sex addicts, and I kind of educate them on the Polyvagal Theory and how we're going to work a little differently. I'm working with somebody who just left before we called, and it's so wonderful because he is saying he couldn't do IFS Sandtray. He couldn't do Sandtray in that way. He's done talk therapy, didn't work. And now I opened up to the Sandplay, and he's like, I don't know what's happening, but I'm not feeling the desire to do what I used to do. And It's only been a couple months. And he's like, I've changed. And I don't know how I'm changing, but it's changing. And I said, I knew that would happen. And we talked about it, and it's really working for him. And it works for a lot of people that come to me over and over and over again. And it's without words. And of course, we talk every now and then, but I will sit quietly and witness as he walks around the tray and walks around the room, picks his miniatures. And I always ask, want to tell me about this world? And most people will say, I don't know what I did. And I said, that's right. You're doing it right. Because the subconscious is really doing a lot of work to let the conscious mind know. Wow.
That experiential piece, that it just seems so profound. So curious, we've got about 5 minutes left before we start to wrap up. Is there anything that we haven't covered, or any thoughts that are just kind of lingering in your mind that you'd like to share with our guests?
I think you did a beautiful job. I think you did really a very good job. And there's nothing lingering for me I feel like I said a lot, and my energy was pretty intense because I really believe in this. I love it.
Yeah.
And the passion. This is my passion. It's like, it sits so well with me, and I love what I do, and I'm seeing people heal, and from doing something that everybody says this makes no sense.
Yeah.
I said that too.
Sure.
I even said that. And so I remember I went through my process, and it's just nice to know. And when they do certain types of trays, I'll say, I remember, well, I don't normally wouldn't say this, but when I sit with them, I'm thinking, oh, I remember when I did this fire stuff or this death stuff. And I had no idea why I was using death in images, but we say it's a spiral and the ego has to descend the ego doesn't want us to ascend because part of it will die off, but when it comes out, it's it comes out with a new way of being. And so when the dissension, we're always spiraling inward or outward. And that's part of it. It's the spiral. And I use imagery of spirals here, but I know what they are, but it's like a hint to the subconscious. We're going to do spiraling, right?
Yeah.
We're going to do something that's a little different. And I have these shells. I don't know what they are, but they're spiral shells and they sit right in front of the client.
Wow.
Yeah, it's funny.
So if one of the listeners has been listening to Sandplay and this is new to them, they're really excited about Sandplay and maybe finding a Sandplay therapist for themselves. If you search psychology today, is there a Sandplay?
Well, you can put in Sandplay, but in Massachusetts, there's only 3 registered Sandplay therapists at this point. One is they're all in opposite ends. I'm in North Andover, somebody's in the western part of the state, and somebody's in New Bedford, right? There are very, very few of us. And I wish there's more. I'm hoping that there will be. And so what I would suggest they do is go to Sandplay Therapists of America. It's called STA, Sandplay Therapists of America. And there's a website to find a therapist. And there's not a lot of them, but there are enough. There are enough.
Good. Great. And then before I ask you the last question that I ask our guests, could you give the guest your contact information, where they can find you if they're interested in what you've been sharing?
Yeah, my podcast. Hold on a second. So sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, so my information is you can look me up at peghurleydawson.com. You can look me up at integratedsandtherapy.com, which talks a little bit about Sandplay. And I have ifssandtray.com. So you can link to all the websites that I have on the peghurleydawson.com. And feel free to link, and then you can send me an email, and I'd be happy to correspond with anybody, and be happy to talk to you about how to find your own path in this, find somebody. And it's really, Sandplay is experiential. So you really need to find somebody to do it with, or hopefully if you can find somebody. It's a little challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll link to all that in the show notes. And the last question I ask guests is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Oh my God, there's so much hope. The fact is, there's so much hope. And sometimes when you feel, I'm going to use the polyvagal language, sometimes when you feel dorsal vagal or checked out, I can't, this is terrible. What am I doing? I absolutely can't do this. I can't suffer like this anymore. Oh my God, that's a moment. And you can do it. And it feels like you can't, but just mobilize, start moving, start doing yoga, doing whatever it takes, go for a walk. And that's helpful. It's helpful. But there is so much hope. And if you find somebody that you connect with as a therapist, really get to know them, and if they don't work, if you find somebody who doesn't work, find somebody who does. And if they pathologize you, find somebody who won't.
Yes. I tell the people who consult me the same thing, and friends of mine who ask for advice looking for a therapist. I say, find a therapist who you really align with, who you really have that connection with, who you really believe can help you. It's so, I think sometimes people think they just need to find although just all therapists are created equal, and just find yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and the piece of moving, yoga, exercise. Like I know for me, when I'm feeling a little down, getting out in the sunlight, exercising goes a long way.
Well, it actually is because you're mobilizing in a safe way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, for those that mobilize in non-safe ways or places that mobilize in ways that get them in trouble, try mobilizing exercise and try mobilizing doing something. Try it before you engage in something you don't want to do, or just try it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Dawson, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.